Thank you so much for the kind words and the invitation from colleagues who have showed up, and for people I've never met before. It's nice to share this wonderful spring afternoon with you inside. I will, as already suggested, explore the relevance of migration as a story, as a prism to understand and think about our contemporary world, but focus primarily on three cases that I think will help shed light on approaches to understanding our current migratory issues in new ways. So, in other words, using history as a way to garner new methods, new categories, and new perspectives to understanding our contemporary world. I hope the audience further afield can hear what I'm saying. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read a prepared script in order to more or less fit within 40 minutes what are the main points of emphasis I would like to make. The migration story inflicting so much hand-wringing in Europe today, I believe suffers from a rigid framing of just how conflicted are these times of seemingly unique migratory crisis. While incremental to the casual European observer living through these changes, it is evident that the discourse around migration is not reflective of deeper historic understandings of this so-called problem today. For one, we often misread current conflicts over migration as driven by structural demolition abroad, disaster out there, that induces both emigration to Europe and informs our responses to the arrival of these outsiders. As such, we commit errors by failing to learn from past stories of migration that come to European shores in periodic waves for hundreds of years already. I wish to use this lecture to share a sampling of my research over the last 20 years into the lives of those whose very instability left an imprint on what became the foundations of our modern world. Tied to a deeper state investment into controlling the unpredictable and thus costly ebbs and flows of North Atlantic capitalism, the cases to which I refer today are meant to complicate otherwise reductive discussions about the migratory story. Of the three distinctive stories we follow here today, the larger setting of an Ottoman Empire in the throes of transformation deserves some initial reflection. It is the larger enterprise of Ottoman subjects mediating the encroachments of capitalist imperialism that inform our comparisons today. Diverse societies in the Balkans, Bilad al-Sham, and Black Sea had by the 1850s experienced the phenomena of massive demographic change. With Russian expansion inducing emigration from Tatarstan, present-day Ukraine, and the Caucasus, the Ottoman Empire became the primary theater of struggle for the resulting competing capitalist imperial projects of the era. The consequential emergence of new state administrative tactics shaped a relationship the Ottoman Empire would have with the larger world, and thus directly impacted the lives of these millions of Muslims, Christians, and Jews who were directly impacted by this competitive dynamic. And as I've argued persistently over several years of research and publications, this extends deeply into the 20th century. Among those most affected lived in Greater Syria. As it governed Syria, the Ottoman Empire sought to manage this era of imposed reforms demanded by financial and military European backers in this wave of transitional reforms in the periods from 1839 to 1858. I would suggest that these reforms were akin to IMF austerity regimes imposed on societies today. For Ottoman dependency on international capital to finance a shift in state power, known in the literature as the Tanzimat, actually impacted the lives of those forced by way of reform to integrate into an emerging global economy. Perhaps the greatest impact of these changes was the rationalization of land use in Greater Syria and the Balkans as well. Such investments in profitable agriculture induced the first migrations from the countryside to Ottoman cities like Beirut, Damascus, Istanbul, Salonika, and Aleppo. Soon, these same uprooted peasants assimilated into a global economic machine that jettisoned hundreds of thousands of them to seek economic salvation and/or political reorientation in the larger world. The resulting emigrations to capitalist colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia complicated relations between migrants and the host societies that were supposedly to absorb them and often exploit them for generations. I have studied these tensions, and rather than understood as destructive, I argued, and by discovering, they actually proved constitutive of what we understand as modernity today. They were not destroyers, they were not destroyed peoples, they were indeed productive ones. While not the place to rehash the larger argument developed already 10 years ago, the underlying point I wish to stress here is that no matter the cause of their initial and sometimes secondary and tertiary relocation, Ottoman migrants left an imprint on the structures of society that accommodated them. This is important for the analytical insights gained from recognizing a role for migrants as they adapt to and thus shape the seemingly foreign world around them, then and now. Indeed, migrants in the 19th century, as is today, actually contribute to both destabilizing the societies around them from which who are accommodating them, as well as reconstituting their host societies in positive ways. The resulting readjustments in the context of settlement may thus prove far more consequential to the way we understand the past and thus our present and future, with what we seem to believe a crisis today of migration to Europe. Put differently, if we remain open to reading the presence of migrants as a way to reflect on our own experiences during times of change, rather than use our categories to exclude and differentiate them, we may discover new essential associations that can temper otherwise abusive, exclusionary, and counterproductive measures that seek to regulate migration to and within Europe today. In the modern era, especially in respect to North Atlantic colonial projects in the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia, Syria constitutes a major source. Am I canceling this? There's a message up here on OneDrive status notification. Sorry about that. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, Syria constitutes a major source for human capital jettisoned out to these colonialist projects that required human labor by the hundreds of thousands. Expunged in often painful terms, peasants had for decades been alienated from their lands by the new concessions the Ottoman state availed to their banker lenders. The prime farmlands investors coming from Belgium, France, Italy, America, or Britain helped in casting adrift hundreds of thousands into an internal migratory process that shaped the modern world. Rarely remembered in such terms today, the patterns of dislocation and resettlement accompanied an already established regime of governance associated with the Ottoman Muhajir Commission. This government agency sought to manage the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Muslims from the Black Sea hinterlands and the Balkans starting in the 1950s, and would contribute significantly to how that Ottoman state would manage the emigration of migrants abroad in the subsequent decades. Forced to migrate to what remained of their Ottoman domains, the resulting organization of migration flows helped lay the groundwork for the subsequent, almost simultaneous movement of economic refugees to the larger world. And here I'll now start with my first example of one of those flows, if you will, outwards. In the case of one Najib Salabi, The disruptions that induced his parents' settlement near Beirut allowed the teenager to pursue educational opportunities that this rapidly growing city offered at the time. Among the benefits of migration to Beirut was access to a larger global schema that had counterintuitive consequences for both the young man, Najib Salabi, and the US imperial project that would ultimately recruit him. Salabi first emerges on record as a student of the Syrian Protestant College, now known as the American University of Beirut. Coming originally from an Orthodox Christian family, he converted to American Protestantism as he secured a bachelor's degree in this college. Reflective of the missionary agenda of those recruiting Syrian students to the college from throughout larger Syria, Najib's mentors not only encouraged him to convert to Protestantism, but also to pursue his interest in medicine further afield. He ended up being recruited and sent with a scholarship to study in New York City in 1896. Alas, unable to secure a position in the field of medicine due to him being a non-white Syrian Arab background, Salabi's only recourse was to enlist as a contract assistant surgeon in the American Army during the Spanish-American War of 1898. First based in Cuba, he would learn to conduct anatomical research on tropical diseases, a skill set that would make him attractive for further recruitment as American imperialism needed able-bodied men to go to the Philippines. Volunteering in 1900 to serve as assistant surgeon in the Muslim-dominated Sulu and Mindanao region, located here on the map, Najib demonstrated an adaptability and willingness to use any means to secure association with an American imperial project. He eventually convinced top officials that he had the skills needed to help address their ongoing Muslim-Moro problem. Claiming his background from Syria, Lebanon, and his ability to speak and write Arabic gave him a particular insight into those resisting American power, we find in Najib a case of an Ottoman migrant translating colonial administrative concerns into a window for personal growth. While many other Ottoman Arab Syrians reached the Spanish Philippines by different routes, the case of Najib serves an important reminder of how migration can avail unpredictable opportunities in what seems on the surface to be a period of destitution or discrimination. While this cannot be the place to pursue this aspect of the story too much further, what the Americans discovered upon defeating the Spanish was that their interactions with indigenous Muslims left them with a new kind of racial difference that was destabilizing. In what is beginning to emerge as an entire subfield in the study of American empire, scholars like Robert Vitalis are now revealing that a new form of social science, international relations, would complement an already fertile industry of anthropology or colonial anthropology used to better conquer the peoples of North America initially and now peoples elsewhere in the world. As with the Comanche or the Seminoles, the US occupying regime in the southern islands of Sulu and Mindanao resorted to gaining a particular knowledge of the ways of the native in order to better control them. Now, while they were ignorant of those Muslim polities, American governors sought to recruit those who shared, it was believed, something in common with them. And this is where Najib is very effectively going to market himself as one of those people with something in common. Thinking Islam a universal point of access, the Americans would be convinced by the likes of Salabi, who lobbied for a chance to help them. Having already spent 2 years in the jungles of Sulu working as a nurse, Salabi recognized an opportunity to rise up in the American colonial state at the expense of those he was charged to save. Meeting many in his fieldwork, Salabi realized that he could actually employ, ironically enough, other Ottoman refugees already embedded in local society to help mediate between American colonialism and the indigenous, largely rebellious populations of these areas. So while other migrants from the Ottoman Empire were in solidarity with these indigenous Muslim peoples resisting American imperialism, Najib Salabi elected to take the side of the Americans and market himself as the crucial intermediary. In time, Salabi would become an external Ottoman surrogate whose ethnographic research made him a useful intermediary by enforcing American sovereignty over these so-called Moros peoples, a reference, to, as the Spanish did, to Muslim peoples harking back to the 15th century. At this point, Salabi's career as an imperial surrogate reflects the capacities of even lowly Syrian migrants to capitalize on the misconceptions and racist limitations of empire. By the end of his life, he died in Lausanne in 1935, a once racial other within the context of North America became a primary colonial asset who made political control in the islands possible. Himself entirely ignorant of their culture, Salabi nevertheless saw the opportunity to serve as America's exclusive intermediary by claiming he actually knew something about them. Using Arabic, Salabi gained access to the intercultural knowledge accumulated by migrant Muslim religious leaders who had been there for a generation already. Recognizing that the local Moro panditas, or clergy imams, knew little Arabic or indeed Islamic doctrine, Salabi devised a strategy to override the influence of these other rebellious Arab migrants upon whom local rulers are still dependent. So convincing those enough locals that I actually have insights into Islam that is indeed more authentic than these others who have come a generation earlier. Once he became the primary entry point to these indigenous communities for the new American regime, Salabi's career in empire saw an entirely new and unprecedented upwards trajectory. Critically, it was after meeting an Afghan named Sharif Muhammad Afdal, whom you can see seated the second to the right, that he could gain access to not only Moro customs, learn from this man who had spent a whole life amongst these peoples, but also access to the power circles that would enable him to serve as an intermediary for negotiations. Once familiar with these people that he would claim to know intimately, Salabi moved up in value to the American administration of the region. Opening a channel of communication entirely new for the Americans, Salabi was rewarded for his services by appointment as assistant to the chief of the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes in charge of Moro affairs. Salabi's reassignment to ethnographer in the field actually mirrors the conclusions scholars like Anne Stoller have made while studying Dutch colonial agents in Sumatra. Salabi's constant dislocation proved the preeminent reality of working for an imperial state. I claim that understanding the transformations in Salabi's case is necessary for us to appreciate how migrants today also likely experience migration to America in a multiplicity of ways. It's not a rigid dynamic that is easily predictable. It's one that's actually quite constantly in this process of dislocation. Salabi explored the islands of Sulu and Mindanao with his superior David Barrows, an anthropologist who worked earlier in his career on indigenous North Americans. Named superintendent of education of the islands, later to become the president of the University of California, Berkeley, Barrows directed Salabi to focus on collecting genealogies and the codification of a legal system later used by Americans to dupe the Sultan of his sovereign claims. Empowered by such a task, Salabi later claimed that he served this role as an unbiased scientist, quote, capable of seeing things from the standpoint of a Sulu, unquote. It was Salabi, in other words, who would now speak on behalf of the Moro, whether they liked it or not. By claiming authority over the relations Sulu natives maintained with the violence-prone governor of the region, Salabi would invest his new power to impose a level of colonial oversight familiar to those studying colonial projects elsewhere. In the end, a Syrian migrant experiencing racist barriers for growth in New York adapted and led a campaign to save Mindanao as a missionary, a Protestant missionary would say, and the culture of the Zulus by actually writing their history for them. More radical still, his knowledge of their ways and of Islam more generally, let us not forget he's a Protestant Christian from Orthodox Christian background, although he did speak Arabic, so that gave him very exclusive access to Islam, of course. He convinced his bosses to accept his scheme to modernize local legal codes. What he was doing was he was seeking to induce a kind of regeneration or rebirth, in very Christian terms, I would suggest, of these Moros, who would then be the beneficiaries of a guidance being led into the modern era while still preserving their distinctiveness as a people. Such claims were uttered with the undertones of a Protestant missionary, as I just suggested. The aim, however, to save Moros was only partially realized before the slaughter of those same interlocutors after they challenged Salabi and the Americans. These horrible battles that took place in 1906 are still embedded in the memories of Philippines, even though they entailed mostly the destruction of the peoples in these southern Muslim areas. Such contradictions of massive criminal scale belie a different possible role for such migratory intermediaries of empire, often repeated today. Taking advantage, Salabi fostered his lifelong investment in bilingual education after these key moments of destruction of the peoples. No longer able to resist, Salabi was able to employ what remained of the learned Moros and Arabs still in the area to prepare dictionaries to assist Americans to learn the local languages, to help them, therefore, further govern with a heavy hand. His cadre of local and migrant Arabs also collaborated to develop school readers in the two main Moro languages. These textbooks were just basically translations of American origin elementary primers using Arabic script. Again, something that these peoples did not use in their day-to-day communications. So he was actually creating a new language for these colonized peoples. Crucially, at the same time, these books were typeset in Beirut, a business opportunity he did not miss. The subsequent diasporic networks linking his Ottoman-ruled hometown, Beirut, with American imperialist domination over Muslims in Sulu continued on for decades. Here, Salabi used empire to enrich close collaborators, including members of his immediate family, who would join him to establish a Syrian-American enclave that would dominate aspects of the local economy by the end of World War I. Indeed, you would see throughout Manila and these southern islands, the big landowners would be Christian Syrians. This newfound role as colonialist matured over time as his extended family joined him, allowing Salabi to link new wealth and relative influence inside the American overseas operation to secure the ultimate legitimacy in this system. He would marry a lower-class white European woman in Manila. Salabi was able to achieve the rank he did in the Moro province because he was able to be legally classified in the Philippines as a free white person, something that was still very difficult to claim in North America. As a reward for accommodating domination over the Moros, and thanks to efforts by Syrians in South Carolina at the time, who actually were able to secure through the courts a legal designation of Syrians actually being white, Salabi started the process of becoming a naturalized American citizen. A key factor in this transitional moment was when other American missionaries also recognized value in Salabi's now established brutal role in imperial state agent. The Presbyterian Board of Missions, which had steered the Syrian Protestant college from which Salabi graduated in Beirut, had now been allotted the Visayan Islands by the American government in Washington. These Episcopalians who sought to preserve their whole stranglehold on the missionary project for the entire archipelago of the Philippines established the main Protestant church in one of these Muslim areas of the south, in Zamboanga, with Salabi leading the way. So here we have now Salabi transitioning into another role as an administrator for now a missionary project. The church would appoint Salabi as treasurer of the Zamboanga hospital and to the local advisory board in the islands for agricultural school, which he opened himself with American money in 1916. Salabi now had moved beyond the social scale of a mere officer of American empire, in which there were hundreds, if not thousands, of other white men serving this role. His role to these different iterations of imperial rule actually helped him overcome ethnic and racial difference and reach now a different class of American altogether. Now able to commute to Manila, his knowledge of the Moros, along with his now recognized medical education, he's now suddenly recognized as a doctor, his religion as a Protestant Christian, and his marriage to a white woman from Texas comfortably allied him with the American Protestant elite who have established themselves in Manila at this time. In fact, Salabi's whiteness became pronounced in large part because of the very fact of the presence of Filipinos who were identified as Asiatic Malays and Mongolians. And therefore far from reprieve. They would forever remain a subclass in American imperial categories. Exploiting this whiteness, Najib became the patron of his extended family in Lebanon, as I mentioned before. He invited 4 of his younger brothers, Murad, Amin, Fuad, and Elijah, to establish homes in the Philippines. This wholesale migration dramatized the commercial possibilities of the islands for educated professionals like his brothers. His older brother Murad, for example, resigned his position as headmaster in one of the American mission high schools in Lebanon to arrive in Mindanao and manage an abaca plantation, which was owned by a Lebanese planter who had settled in the Spanish period already. Soon, this same younger brother became the published authority of tropical agronomy and served as chief of the fiber division of the Bureau of Agriculture from 1913 to 1917. Eventually, he would actually go into business, leaving government altogether, and become a very rich man in copra and mining, eventually establishing the Salabi Fiber Company, incorporated in 1926. Najib's younger brother, Amin, came to Manila in October of 1907 after successfully completing a medical degree in Philadelphia. So significantly, within a couple of years, after Syrians were recognized as white, his younger brother could actually get a medical degree where Najib, 7 years earlier, could not, because he was not considered suitable and because he was not white. For his part, Fuad Salabi, another of the brothers, was appointed as a clerk in the Bureau of Public Works in November 1910. More indicative of their collective integration into this economic colonialist machine was the fact that Najib and 2 of his brothers married in Manila white women born in the United States. So not only did Najib, but his 2 younger brothers also married into whiteness. So Najib Salabi had to wait until the conclusion of the war for the opportunity to travel back to his homeland, Beirut, the first time since departing almost a quarter century earlier. Emblematic of his new prominence, he came sauntering back to Beirut and was invited to address the first graduating class of the newly named American University of Beirut. So that gives you a sense of his position back home even. Sharing his impressions of the Philippines, he also received an honorary degree of science. In 1922, after his return to Manila, Salabi was elected a member of the prestigious American Oriental Society, one of those closed, male-dominated organizations that had for a long time identified Syrians as unbecoming, unwanted migrants to America who would dilute the whiteness of the American population. So here's one of the guys who suffered this persecution ending up within this organization, one of the key members. So by formally becoming a member of this organization, Salafi became the emblem of opportunistic careerism, expected of those with any hope of growing in a world enveloped by expansive Euro-American power in the 20th century. So that's one example, I believe, that could be helpful for us in thinking about the possible trajectories of migrants today in our world. And I think you can find many examples of many Najib Salabis in the frame of migration to Europe. Now, I want to highlight just briefly that Americans were also engaged in dealing with other Arab migrants to the Philippines, but on very different terms, and it's a part of the story that I highlight in the book that I mentioned before. And it's a quite interesting comparison of how the imperial project itself is very adaptable, and has an impact on how the Ottoman Empire, for instance, saw itself in the larger context of American competition with British and French in South China Sea. The Ottoman Empire actually forged an alliance with the Americans and sent able-bodied imams to try to help Americans resolve their Muslim problems. But that's, again, a story for another time. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to now introduce another case. Other subjects of the Ottoman Empire also left their hometowns in search of a new life, joining the wave of migration that shaped the Balkans and the larger Eastern Mediterranean for generations. With Fanoli, a contemporary, in fact, of Antonio Gramsci, whose parents hailed from a neighboring valley in southern Tosk, Albania, we may follow a different set of trajectories from Salabi that eventually transformed both the life of Fanoli as a migrant as well as the modern world around him. They actually named a street after him in northern Bronx just this week. A suggestion that the diaspora has identified him as a hero, which in itself is problematic, but I'll explain maybe. Like Salabi, Noli's life proved an informative example of how migration can be an engine of possibilities that also requires we rethink our assumptions about what migrants are up to when they become part of our world today. But crucially, we have to be very careful about how we categorize and study these stories. In the case of an otherwise unextraordinary young man who first migrates to Athens to find work, we discover a new set of relations that upsets the conventional wisdom about Balkan natives and their narrow association with ethno-national and/or religious affiliations. By way of an early ambition to perform in the theater, Noli used his skills as a polyglot to follow a migratory trajectory that erases the normative lines of distinction informing how we interpret Balkan migrations. And more importantly, it complicates how we understand their ambitions, their behavior, and their sense of limitations. With Noli, this entailed a complex story of mobilizing ethnicity. In the case of, in the early part of his life, he mobilized the possibility of becoming a Greek. As an Orthodox Christian, this was something possible in this time. And indeed, he was able to shed certain kinds of barriers to travel by claiming Greek citizenship. Failing in the Athens theater scene, Noli heads to the booming economy of Egypt, where tens of thousands of fellow Tosk-speaking migrants had been settling since the rise of Muhammad Ali's superpower in the 1820s. While using the platform of Greek citizenship and a demand for classical education among the Balkan diaspora who had settled in Egypt's Nile Delta region, Noli's real ambition to perform led him to an inner circle of power established by some of these migrant Tosk Albanian men who had become very affluent indeed, owning cotton-producing lands in and around the Delta and the Cairo suburbs. In other words, Noli is moving in and out of ethnic categories we foreground today as essential to understanding their mobilization, their motivations for travel and settlement in certain areas. So he's able to travel as a Greek, he gets a job in a Greek school, but he immediately starts to integrate himself into a much more cosmopolitan space. which is treated as a nationalist space in some contexts, but I would argue is also problematic. So it is within the social spaces created by the demand for polyglot entertainers that Noli first secured a link to Egypt's working class theaters. This is a fascinating topic in itself, by the way, the entertainment of migratory labor in these, again, polyglot communities that you find throughout the Mediterranean world, whether it be Maltese, various Italian dialects, various Slavic dialects, Greeks, Albanians, Arabs. They have to be entertained, and they end up going to the same spot. So Noli, being a polyglot, is able to write content for a variety of different audiences. As a backstage hand, he wasn't a very good actor, apparently. Ultimately, his skills to write humorous skits in Greek and Tosca Albanian made him essential to the main patrons of these theaters scattered throughout the suburbs of Cairo. One of them being a very interesting figure, more or less forgotten today, Athanas Tashko. He built one of the first operas in Cairo. In time, the extent to which Noli's own ambitions faltered as an actor, his utility to the patrons on whom he became dependent changed. Along with entertaining the tens of thousands of workers coming to the Nile Delta, men like Tashko and Milo Duci became patrons of an emerging political movement whose long-term objectives have been entirely misappropriated by 20th century historians. Tashko and others within his circle of Tosk intelligentsia forged strong ties with Austro-Hungarian and Italian embassy staff in Cairo. They collaborated to lobby diaspora, governments, and investors in Brussels, Napoli, Roma, and soon in Boston to embrace reform within a unified Ottoman Empire. These are not separatists. They're not seeking independence as of yet. They're trying and lobbying for harnessing and modernizing an Ottoman Empire that can preserve and protect their homelands from the annexations of neighboring states. Celebrated as nationalists today, the activities, the organizations, including the transatlantic Vatra movement funded by Tashko, serve a more practical rationale, I am arguing. Union within the Ottoman Empire, a goal that suspended or superseded unimaginable independence prior to 1912. The campaigns led by men like Ibrahim Temo in Romania, Dervish Hima in Rome, Faik Konica in Brussels, and Noli in Boston ultimately transformed the face of the Balkan Wars in 1912. Meaning their roles and their agendas transformed because of events back in the homeland, the disastrous Balkan Wars of 1912. As tens of thousands of migrants from the Tosk Albanian motherland shared the trajectories of thriving communities in the Americas, now large numbers of people are fleeing, especially to what remains the Ottoman Empire, but tens of thousands are now following predecessors across the world. The evolving conditions in the Ottoman Balkans transformed the objectives of such would-be patriots. And this is crucial for us understanding migrants today who are settling in Europe and are very much connected to events back home. They will remain so throughout their lives. Emigration, once considered a long-term political asset for the main economic backers of future leaders like Noli, who will be sent by Tashko to the Americas to set up and strengthen the diaspora there in order to lobby on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, would soon become a threat, would soon have to adapt and change because of these inherent threats by 1912. And it's crucial to appreciate this because those who were encouraging migration in the past, because of course migration, sending money back actually improves the economic conditions of the homeland, a strategy of migration that has long been part of the calculus of migration, is now being considered as a danger to the homeland. So the diaspora, the world that thrust Noli into several stages of migration, induced a new strategic orientation for those once seeking a broader Tosk Ottoman imprint on the world. Now faced with a diplomatic calculus that prefaced rights to statistics, who lived where, Noli and allies had to rethink the fate of the homeland in face of annexations by Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro. For one, they had to assure their homeland no longer exported talent in order to thwart future League of Nations commissions allocating lands to post-Ottoman regimes on the basis of the numbers of people who lived there. To save the homeland, in other words, Vatra, this organization funded initially in Egypt, had to reverse the migratory process and assure the presence of Albanian households in lands that were still up for grabs in 1912, 1913. Migration at this moment of transition thus became a threat to the homeland under new managerial demands imposed from outside. Noli's task thus changed, yet again, now to command, using his parallel role as now a spiritual leader, that Albanians must stay home. And this is a diaspora newspaper published in Trieste telling them not to go to America. Moshkon in Amerik, don't go to America. So this is the idea of preserving the homeland. We need able-bodied people to stay now and protect the homeland, to actually be counted as inhabitants. The most important actors shaping the future possibility of an Albanian existence as a people were those living in this Tosk Albanian Ottoman diaspora that had spread globally by the end of the 19th century. Now, my brief expose of Noli's contribution reflects the complex intersecting paths of transition that helped contain the skills of such personalities for important points in their lives. For this, the social and cultural, let alone political economic context of the geographically scattered activist Ottoman Albanians were necessarily the arenas of focus for a certain period of time. Far from the entrenched categories systematically applied to studying this period, during the interwar period, progressive politicians and cultural leaders like Noli necessarily took dramatic departure from their past roles. And this is a very interesting case with Noli. It is this break in Noli's political and spiritual cultural calculations that marks the near erasure of his former Ottoman Albanian existence, taking place amid numerous linked diasporas spread globally by the end of the 19th century. By 1912, the major cities were inhabited by a remarkable array of humanity, with Ottoman subjects proving key. As seen earlier with Tosk activists, oops, I jumped. The personalities linked to Noli's life hint at the need to seek yet more alien trajectories in the world, pathways of migration that reflect another set of contingent associations that demand a new look when considering our current concerns with migrations to Europe. Like Salabi's story, following Noli throughout the interwar period when he was both founder of the Albanian Autocephalous Church, so Albanians would be able to secure a national church akin to other Balkan natives. He would later become a radical president for a short term in independent Albania in 1920. We begin to finally uproot the interwar era from its variety of conflicted, mutually exclusive narratives of ethno-nationalism, of sectarianism. Progressive politicians and cultural leaders like Noli necessarily took a dramatic departure from the past that I suggest is something that we have to allow for the possibility as we engage migrants today. That they are not fixed and entrapped in an association, that they are constantly navigating the contours of a changing world. We continued our pursuit of complexity and diversity of experience to belabor this larger point about rethinking the migration story in Europe today. As North America served as a magnet of migration for men like Van Noli and Najib Salabi on very different missions, so too would Latin America serve this role. Ottoman settlements, just like with settlement from the larger Mediterranean world, followed the extractive industries of capitalism deep into the booming economies of Sao Paulo state, Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires in particular. The plunder of these cities' hinterlands offered an equally opportunistic settings for these migrants, as the Philippines did for Najib Salabi. While deemed foreign by European white elites in both Brazil and Argentina, the colonies of Ottoman migrants established themselves as key allies in the violent battle for ascendancy over indigenous peoples and then over nature. The resulting development of vast territories required the same profile of migrant as we find in North America at the time, in the Philippines, in Palestine, and South Africa. In other words, settlers with a penchant for cooperative engagement with select native communities and violent genocide of those who resist. By 1912, the major cities of South America were inhabited by a remarkable array of humanity, with Ottoman subjects proving especially key in certain sectors of their economies. As seen earlier with Tusk activists lobbying for the preservation of the Ottoman Empire in order to protect the homeland in this transitional era from 1908 to 1912, the threat of war also animated new associations in South America. I cannot stress enough how this aspect is relevant to our appreciating how migrants to the Netherlands or larger fortress Europe are impacted by the conditions of their homelands today. And I think there needs to be more studies that does not isolate migrants in an exclusive European context. They come from somewhere, and scholars studying them here need to understand the context from which they leave, and they're very much invested in following. The growing transnational commercial links Ottoman, Syrian, and Albanian diasporas in Argentina and Brazil developed became a moment for influence as well, that well into World War I took the form of lobbying for the Ottoman state's survival. Again, they're not seeking separation, they're not seeking independence, they're lobbying for strengthening the Ottoman Empire. They see it as a tool for survival of their homelands. Indeed, by referencing the newspapers Syrian Ottomans published in Sao Paulo, Rio, and Buenos Aires, it is possible to appreciate the active conversation going on between the two countries and their diasporas. Reading their newspapers also help us reflect on how strong the ties of these Ottoman diasporas had and maintained with the homeland. The Sao Paulo monthly Al Farid, for instance, published by one Ibrahim Farah, judiciously reported events in the Ottoman Empire from 1910 to 1918. Similarly, in Argentina, the most active supporters of Ottoman patriotism were the Christian brothers Miguel and Naguib Samra, who published Al-Zaman out of Buenos Aires. To demonstrate their patriotism, the Samra brothers celebrated the newly established Constitution in 1908. By declaring in an editorial their loyalty to Ottoman unity on behalf of the majority of émigrés in Argentina. This embrace of Ottoman survival was to serve as a clear statement in face of rising evidence that France, in particular, was cultivating a separatist movement both in Syria and amongst these Ottoman Syrian diaspora around the world. It was during the same Balkan Wars of 1912 that newspapers like the Al-Uthmani, published by a textile merchant in Rio de Janeiro, openly supported, as their Argentine counterparts, the Ottoman war efforts. They raised money, they lobbied through embassies to promote the idea of protecting the Ottoman Empire, even the Balkans, while war in their homelands were not affected. Now, an interesting memoir of an Ottoman Syrian migrant to Brazil, Taufik Doğan, has left some important insights into just how this diaspora were unified around this cause of protecting the Ottoman Empire from war. Ottomanism was clearly an ideological tool to stave off the great powers, and it was mentioned in this memoir that, that the concerns that loyalists had primarily were in finding ways to communicate their loyalty to the Ottoman Empire to a larger world far away here in Latin America. And one interesting example that I discovered was that the Ottoman diaspora combined efforts in both Brazil and Argentina. They were able to work together in tandem. is all the more impressive when you consider the other factors that the Japanese or Italian or Greek communities were not able to actually conjoin efforts. The fact that you have now Albanians and Arabs of different religions actually working collectively for a common cause is an interesting dynamic that may actually be something to observe here as well. Now, in this case, in this picture, you have the same Vatra organization that was funded out of Egypt and developed in Boston under Noli has a branch in Argentina. And despite the fact that Albania is now under occupation of Italians and Greeks, they're still flying a flag of solidarity with the Ottoman case. Indeed, trying to lobby powers in Buenos Aires to bring Ottoman power back or authority back to occupied Balkans. Now, clearly such collaborations was a response to a number of initiatives, including French propaganda prior to World War I that aimed to turn Syria and the Balkans into a sectarian morass. Again, Christians, Jews, and Muslims together made a very explicit comment about what the French, for instance, were doing, trying to encourage separation along religious lines. This mechanism of resistance had a second function, I argue. The vociferous support of the diaspora in Brazil and Argentina demanded that Istanbul had regular consultations with them. They wanted to actually have a communication with this new government established after 1908. And here they lobbied for the establishment of an embassy. The episode of Ottoman subjects from not only Arab but also Albanian and Greek heritage uniting to collectively lobby for the appointment of an Ottoman diplomatic representative in Buenos Aires proves very instructive. And I think we could find similar dynamics at play amongst migration flows today. In 1910, the appointment of Representative Emir Arslan, an Ottoman Druze with strong loyalties to the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turk Party, constituted a major victory for Ottoman loyalists facing hostility from increasingly nativist Argentina government and an emergent French-supported Syrian nationalist minority amongst them. That the appointed representative was a member of a family itself divided in their loyalties warrants even greater investigation. So, for example, while Arslan's cousin, Fadil, who was the Ottoman consul in Rio, so again, it's all within the family, two Druze representatives in South America for the Ottoman Empire. Other members of the same family were in fact in exile in Switzerland and were on the side of the French, at least until the French occupied Damascus in 1920. That Arslan, the Buenos Aires Council eventually abandoned the Ottoman state himself during World War I, suggests the influences of ever-changing geopolitical events, both in the empire and abroad, require deeper consideration as we study migrants today in Europe. As an aside, this is also something that historians need to avoid, making assumptions that there is a viability or failure of Ottoman patriotism during this period as well. So by that's a commentary to those of you who are interested in this late period of Ottoman Empire. Now, to conclude, the three cases discussed here offer a sampling of the diversity of processes, experiences, and possibilities that I argue inform the evolution of the entire modern era as we know it. Their institutions, their economies of scale. The trajectory of these men required traversing oceans as much as upsetting the categories long used to associate them with one framing of historic change while excluding others. I used the migration stories of these three distinctive sets of Ottoman subjects to both induce a new understanding of this period they were living, from which they were all going to become important contributors to their respective host societies, as well as introduce categorical ruptures that may help us reflect differently on Europe's current dilemmas around migration. Thank you for your patience, and looking forward to your comments, critiques, and otherwise. Thank you.